Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. My name is Bharath and I work as a program manager at the Takshashila Institution. So before we get started with today's podcast, I would just like to give a shout out to our education programs. As you might know, Takshashila is a non-partisan think tank and a school of public policy. The admissions are ongoing for our 12-week graduate certificate in public policy. You can apply to 3 different streams: advanced public policy, defense and foreign affairs, and tech and policy. So this is mostly held on Saturdays. It's completely online and it's designed for people like you. So the last day for applications is 27th August. So please visit school.takshila.org.in to learn more. So we have with us today Prateek, Waghre and Tejasi, Panjiar. So Prateek is Policy Director at Internet Freedom Foundation. Prior to this, he was with the Takshashila Institution and he's been a regular on the All Things Policy podcast. So you might have heard his voice a lot more than you heard mine. So, and Tejasi is Associate Policy Counsel at Internet Freedom Foundation. And I think this would be your first time on this podcast, Tejasi. So, welcome to All Things Policy and looking forward to the conversation with you.
Hey, Bharat, thanks for having us over. Yeah, and I'm hoping long-time listeners have not forgotten at least my voice, if not me.
So today we are going to talk about India's data protection bill. It's been subject of much debate over the past 4 years. There's been a lot of pushback against some section of the bill by civil society organizations and tech companies. So this bill was recently withdrawn by the Union Minister for Communications and Information Technology, Mr. Ashwini Vaishnav. And the reason given was that there are a lot of changes which were proposed by the Joint Committee of Parliament. And so in order to incorporate all of these changes, they decided to come up with a new bill instead of, working on it again. So the JCP recommendations, which came out late last year, proposed around 81 amendments and 12 recommendations to the bill that had 99 sections. So before we get into this, so this is like a brief background. So Internet Freedom Foundation has done a lot of work studying this bill and raising a lot of concerns associated with it. So it'll be nice to have a conversation with Prateek and Tejasi about the insights they have about this topic. So to start off with, I would like to understand what are some of the main criticisms about the data protection bill over the time that it has been undergone many revisions, right? So what have been the main concerns and criticisms about this? Tejasi, would you like to?
Yes, thanks, Bharat. So like you said, it's gone through many revisions. It's been 4 years in the making, more even. And so broadly speaking, the criticism has been that through this bill, which should have ideally been to empower the users with rights surrounding their personal information and their data, the government has essentially used this bill to extract monetary value of data. And they've left no stone unturned in doing so. It has failed to prioritize the user, and instead it prioritizes big corporations. It provides large exemptions to the government departments, and it does not adequately respect our fundamental right to privacy. This, along with the context, which is the lack of literacy around data protection in India, it becomes dangerous on an individual level and on a collective level, given how it makes allowances for mass surveillance. Now, this was on the broader level. Maybe on the specific level, the tone is that, like I mentioned, one, it gives primacy to economic interests. Some other concerns are also that there's been a notable reduction in the autonomy and the powers of the Data Protection Authority. There's been an expansion of the regulatory scope, which has included its ambit by including non-personal data. And the supposed voluntary self-verification of social media users undermines the principle of data minimization.
Yeah, it's been an interesting thing, right? I think as Tejasi pointed out, we've had multiple iterations of it. And I think, from a civil society perspective, what we've also seen is, I think with every iteration, some things have gotten, further from where we wanted them to be. Right? Like the Data Protection Authority is an excellent example of that, because an institution that's going to have the amount of importance as the Data Protection Authority, you ideally want it to be an independent one, right? But what we've seen is sort of dilution of that through the various versions of the bill. That's sort of been our concerns through this process.
So Apart from the concerns to civil society, are there also a lot of the tech companies have raised concerns that it can stifle innovation because of the data localization norms and all of that? So is the pressure from these companies the reason why these changes have been? I mean, it's not been passed. What could be the reason for the surprising withdrawal of the bill?
Yeah, so we're a little bit in the realm of speculation there, right? And it's also interesting you say surprising, because this is something that that I've noticed, in the sense that there were some reports a couple of months ago that indicated, hey, maybe the bill is going to be withdrawn, there's going to be a new bill, but it's also had statement by either the union minister or the minister of state saying that, okay, it will be tabled in the monsoon session, right? But if you go back and ask people now, a lot of them say, hey, yeah, of course we knew that the bill was going to withdraw. I was certainly surprised, right? But, again, going back to the other point of yours, in terms of, is this necessarily pressure from companies? Look, it's hard to rule that out. But one issue I have with that is this framing of, hey, is it, it's the foreign companies that are doing it. Again, we don't necessarily know for sure which companies are doing it. I think, from a profit-seeking corporation perspective, the incentive is always going to be to try and stave off regulation as far as possible, and that's probably what they've done, right? But the fact remains that it was still within the government control to decide, to push forward with this bill or not, right? And we've been very vocal. A lot of sections of society have been very vocal with their criticism of the bill. But it was also important to have this bill, in place, so that you could then start building off from here, right? Because right now at a stage where we potentially don't know of, when when any sort of follow-up data protection legislation will come. And I will be probably get to that specific question later on. But that's just the broader point also that I want to.
Right. So, like when you speak about it's better to have even the bill in its current form rather than not having one. So, could you tell us more about why is it important to have the data protection bill and what happens to all the data that's collected while we wait for, I mean, in the absence of such a bill? So, if you could maybe take an example of how the data would be processed in the absence, and how would it really affect a normal user when it comes to their data being collected?
Okay, so before I get into an example, just points that I want to be right. In the sense that we had a very difficult choice between a flawed bill and no bill, right? But in that sense, given that extremely poor set of choices, it was probably better to have a flawed bill that we could then build off, right? Either through some form of just litigation, or amendments and stuff like that. Right? So it was essentially, you want to start laying the building blocks of a genuinely privacy preserving data protection. No law is going to be perfect at its conception, right? There is always going to be a phase where, it needs to be improved, even with the various concerns that we had with this bill. Right now, I'm not saying, that I don't think anyone of civil society wholeheartedly supported it. There were obviously very, very strong reservations. But the idea was that you wanted to be able to get a move on and start building towards a functional data protection regime. Right? Now, the other part of the question of why is it important to have a data protection law that's based on consent and accountability. Let me just throw some numbers, right? In the sense that, so there was recently a joint report by IMAI and Consult which said that, look, currently India has somewhere in the range of estimated 700 million internet users. I know there are slightly different estimates for this, but the idea was that it's not. So their estimate was that 700 today, like to go up to 900 million sometime in 2025. Right? And about, we're also expecting that more than 50% are going to be from, potentially going to be from rural areas. So this links back to the point that Tejasi made about literacy playing an important role. And about potentially half of these, around 350 million, 340 million, are transacting in some way, right? Whether it's, e-commerce, digital payments, etc. Right? And then you look at the more consumer side of it, where you have things like WhatsApp that have, 550 million users. You have a number of social media platforms that potentially have about 200, 300 million users as well, right? This is all happening in parallel with a wave of digitalization of even government responsibility, right? So whether it's health, whether it's education, whether it's agriculture, right? You've had this tendency to really move towards a digital delivery. All of that involves personal data being used in some way or the other. Just to give you some examples, and this is from some of the work that IFF has done. So if you go back to the announcement of Ayushman Bharat Digital Mission in 2020, since then there have been multiple building blocks of the health ecosystem as such, right? If I can use that term in quotes, that have been rolled out, such as you have the health data management policy. You've got, unique health identifier rules, right? Unified health interface, health data retention policy, and there were some data sharing guidelines which were under the Pradhan Mantri Jan Arogya Yojana. Right? So you had these multiple consultation papers or these initiatives being announced, and all of this is happening without any sort of data protection law in place. Right? Then you also have to look at that in parallel with the fact that very often there is episodic reports of breaches, right? So back in there was this phase in 2021 where you had a lot of very large, either e-commerce platforms or things like that, where we were seeing reports of data breaches. Now again, the tricky situation we are in India is that companies rarely confirm, right? And there is no law that mandates them to do so. More often than not, they point fingers at the cybersecurity researchers, right? So that expose or reveal these breaches or report them. That's probably more appropriate word. Right? But you have a lot of these cases of sometimes, if not hundreds of millions, but tens of millions of user accounts being compromised. And you also have similar things happening with government websites. Right? There is, all these aspects of it. And if you look across, at maybe some countries which have some sort of functioning data protection regime, right? So if you look at the UK's Information Commissioner's Office, they have, so on their website, they actually list the number of, the actions that they've taken, right? So I think as of around approximately a week ago, they've listed about 100 different actions that they've taken across things like, just enforcement notices, actual prosecution, or monetary penalties, right? Similarly, if in Australia, I think their Office of the Information Commissioner is currently investigating the use of facial recognition surveillance by various retailers. Yeah? So, and when you look at India, we're sort of normalizing surveillance in schools and policing and that, right? So when you have a functional data protection regime, you have these, you have the ability to act and react when things like this happen. And just the final point I'll make in terms of, why do we need what's that is, there's a very interesting paper by Danielle Keats, Citron, and Daniel J. Solove, which talks about privacy harms, right? And I think they note that privacy harms accumulate across society. They're not necessarily at at the individual level, but they accumulate and they categorize them into physical, economic, reputational, psychological, harm based on autonomy, discrimination, and relationship harm. Right? And that's an interesting paper. I think we can share a link. It's worth looking up if you are interested in the type of harms that can arise. In a from a privacy perspective.
Just to comment on like why we need this bill, why we need this bill and why we need it now is, in the backdrop of digitalization that's occurring across every sector in India. And one was what Prateek mentioned, the health sector. And then there's education, there's agriculture, there's finance. So digitization across all these sectors, that personal data is going to be collected, it's going to be stored, processed. And so such violations of, like say, data breaches or privacy violations may occur more often than not. And so data breaches, Prateek has already spoken about, but how this impact and the existing legal vacuum, the impact that it has on users is that essentially, as of today, there exists no remedy for Indians in case of any violation of their digital rights, which is why today India desperately needs a data protection legislation.
Right. So having such a legislation would force the data fiduciaries to be more cognizant of the harms that it would cause and take precautions to avoid any breaches or misuse of the data and things like that, right?
I think it would definitely be the first step. There'll be checks and balances, there'll be accountability. So in the absence of allegation, and most importantly, there'll be a grievance redressal mechanism. This is a constitutionally guaranteed right, the right to privacy. And we need 5 years back, the whole movement to start a data protection legislation in India started with that judgment. So yeah, like you said, absolutely, there'll be some sort of mechanisms for data fiduciaries, for the government even, to make sure that our rights are protected and empowered.
Right. And I think even with GDPR in its current form, there have been concerns that, from tech companies that it stifles innovation or it needs to do more it needs to be more flexible, things like that. So there's no such thing as a perfect bill, and having something, even if it's a work in progress, would help you get to a better place than where we are now. So before we go ahead and look at what changes we would like in this bill and what we could expect going forward, Let's take a quick break and we'll be back to talk further on this. So, welcome back. We have with us Prateek and Tejasi. So, when we're talking about the data protection bill, so if there's going to be a revised bill that's going to be expected, say in the winter session or maybe later next year, what do we expect? I mean, what are the main changes that you would like to see when this revised bill is introduced?
So I think this again ties back to the criticisms, right? Firstly, I think it's important to remember that the latest version of the bill, the DPB 2021, has witnessed significant deterioration when you compare it with its predecessors. So the Personal Data Protection Bill 2018 and the Personal Data Protection Bill 2019, as it was introduced in the Parliament, since then that we have been seeing deterioration, and during this journey which started more than 4 years back, a lot of feedback and input was provided by technical experts, civil society and digital rights organizations. Like you mentioned, some concerns were even raised by businesses on innovation, and also several members of parliament even filed dissent notes raising detailed concerns on various provisions of the DPP bill. So at the very least, I believe during when the comprehensive legal framework, as the ministry has termed it, during the formation and drafting of this framework, these inputs must be considered and taken into account because they do serve a lot of value. Also, I think the main tone of the bill should be to safeguard digital rights and to prioritize the interests of the users over big corporations, which is at the moment how what the tone is like. And we also hope that the new law holds the government accountable and instills checks and balances in letter and in spirit instead of providing large exemptions for them.
I just add a couple of things, right? Again, long time listeners will know that I love making these broad meta points. So there's just, so even in terms of like the fundamental approach, and I face you this pointing out, I don't think anywhere through this process there was this investigation of, hey, why do we need to gather so much data? Right? It was just the fact that you had so much data being generated and floating around there. It was taken as a given, and then hey, let's build from there rather than going back and sometimes asking the most fundamental question of, look, why do we need so much data? If there an if there a concept of data minimalization that we can, data minimalism, sorry, that we can sort of look to bring in as well, right? And that's in contrast to, if you go back to the famous or the infamous chapter 4 of the Economics Overview of India 2018-2019, which said, data is a public good, right? And I think this view of looking at it as sovereign wealth, right, which is catching on. And I know there will be many who disagree with me on this, but this view of looking at data as something that's as a sovereign wealth resource, that at a national level, also then create these incentives for some form of monetization of this data. Right, you're looking at it in from a trade framework rather than from a rights framework, and I think that's something that's always been concerning, and which is what I had said, when we said that, look, perhaps we're looking at this incorrectly. It's not data that we should be treating as a public good, but maybe it's privacy that we should be treating as a public good, right? And I think, again, I'll refer listeners to a paper by Joshua Fairfield and Christoph Engel, which talks about privacy as the idea of privacy as a public good. And again, they make again interesting point in there. And I just want to quote this section, semi-quote this section from the paper where they talk about the fact, or they talk about the possibility that that privacy falls prey to social dilemmas, and the way individuals make decisions about privacy, right, tends to diverge from what's to the benefit of the group or to society. I thought that was a very interesting concept, especially when you couple that with with the Danielle Citron and Daniel J. Solove paper talking about where they talk about harms being aggregated, right, and then building up. So I think that's something that we should consider as well.
Yeah, that's so true because, and considering how the data protection bill itself started, it was born out of the right to privacy judgment, and after that is where all of this conversation started. So privacy is, I think, really important, and it should be like the main thing that should be the focus of the data protection bill, not the monetization or the economic. I mean, not you considering data as a sovereign wealth and trying to monetize that or generate value from that.
Yeah, and I'll add, right, and I think Anubhav will get very angry if they completely exclude the economics. So I think there is there is room for the economic aspect of it, but I think the point that we're making is that the protection of privacy has to be the core principle, and then the others build from there, rather than it potentially being the other way around.
Yeah, that's true. I think Anupam will also not like, he might have a very strict definition of a public good. I don't know how.
Anupam doesn't like most things that say.
So last question now. So when can we expect the revised bill to be passed, and how? So there's talk about a comprehensive framework, and not just the data protection bill in isolation. But so what can we expect going forward? How does this look like it's going to pan out?
Well, Bharat, the move to withdraw the data protection bill was surprising and it left us perplexed. And we have similar feelings about what lies ahead, to be very honest. And I think a lot of this is stemming from the fact that, we've had, and we spoke about this briefly in the beginning, was that there have been such conflicting statements from the ministry that's been covered by the media, some of which indicated that the bill, the DPB, would be tabled in the recently concluded monsoon session. Prior to that, there was some coverage that indicated it's tabling in the budget session 2022. So one might understand why it's difficult for us to answer this question, to predict the future of the legislation, what the comprehensive legal framework would entail, what it would look like. There are some statements given by unnamed officials covered by the media that says the government might table it in the winter session that'll be held in December. But we'll just have to wait and see. What we can hope, though, is for fresh public consultations, for the framework, for the government to release a white paper justifying what recommendations given by the GPC they choose to include or not to include, follow a very transparent method and procedure during this entire process, and come out with a timeline as soon as possible so we have more clarity on the future of the bill.
Yeah, I did add, right? So there are some statements that said that, that there might potentially be some sort of timeline that's put out in late August for this, I'm doing air quotes, you won't see it, comprehensive legal framework, right? That we keep hearing about. But I think, let's say it gets tabled either in the winter session or the budget session. As she was pointing out, we also want to ensure then that once this is tabled, there needs to be ample time for public consultation or whatever the new version of the bill is. There should be, ideally a healthy level of debate in the parliament over the bill itself, right? You also then want to ensure that, whatever provisions are enacted, there is enough time given for industry to be able to comply. Because you also don't want to create a shock over there. So if I were being optimistic and just for the sake of putting some sort of timeline to it, right, I think we're probably looking at a minimum of 12 to 18 months before we have a functional regime. Right? And I'm not saying when the bill is passed, because I really don't know when it will come out. The order of this changes within seconds sometimes now with the way Parliament is often conducted. So it's very hard to predict that. But we're, especially looking at 12 to 18 months till we have some sort of functional regime. It's also interesting you asked this question because, I just remembered back in 2019 when we were talking about data protection bill. So it was incidentally Rohan, me and Atri Agarwal, who was with Media Rama at the time. And towards the end of that podcast episode, we said, hey, how long before the data protection bill is enacted? Or at that point, it was the personal data protection bill. I don't remember what we said, but I don't think any of us had 3 years for it to be withdrawn as one of our answers.
That's an interesting flashback. So yeah, thanks Tejasi and Prateek. It's been a really insightful conversation. And looking forward to how this is going to pan out, and looking forward to your work on this. So it gives us a lot of context about how these issues are shaping up. So for anyone who's interested, the Internet Freedom Foundation works on a range of issues, including net neutrality, free expression, privacy, and innovation. So you must check out the work they do. So you can head over to internetfreedom.in to find out more. So yeah, thank you everyone. Have a nice day.
Thanks.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.